Have you ever watched someone walk away when all they wanted to do was stay? Have you ever seen someone go completely silent right when the conversation gets real? Have you noticed how some people build walls not because they do not care, but because they care so deeply that it terrifies them? Here is what most people get completely wrong about those people. Most people look at someone who pulls away, someone who goes cold, someone who disappears emotionally, and they label that person as selfish. They call them a coward. They say they cannot commit. They say they do not have feelings. And that is where everyone gets it wrong, because those people are not cold. They are not heartless. They are not incapable of love. They are actually the opposite. They feel so much that their nervous system cannot handle it. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It protects them by making them disappear. That is what this video is about. Today, we are going to talk about a specific pattern that plays out again and again in the lives of people who are emotionally avoidant, not in a blameful way, not to label anyone as broken, but to understand something that the vast majority of people never understand. We are going to look at what happens inside the mind of an avoidant when they feel powerless. And specifically, we are going to break down 4 things they do when that feeling takes over. Now, why does this matter for you? Why should you care? Because whether you are someone who has avoidant tendencies yourself or you have been close to someone who does, this information is going to change how you see things. It is going to dissolve confusion, it is going to remove guilt, and most importantly, it is going to open a door that you probably did not know existed, a door toward understanding, toward healing, toward connection. Here is what you are going to get by the end of this video. You are going to understand exactly why avoidants do the things they do. Not from a surface level, not from a textbook level, but from the inside, from the emotional and psychological level where the real patterns live. You will understand the 4 specific behaviors that emerge when an avoidant feels like they are losing control. And more importantly, you will understand why none of these behaviors mean what you probably think they mean. This is not just information. This is transformation. Because once you understand the machine, you can change the machine. And that changes everything. But I need you to stay until the very end. I need you to, because the final part of this video is where the real power lives. The beginning will open your eyes. The middle will challenge your assumptions. But the end will give you something you can actually use. Something that can shift the way you show up in your own relationships. Something that can help you stop repeating patterns that keep you stuck. So do not skip. Do not bounce. Stay with me all the way through. Because the way this video ends is going to give you something most people never get. A real, practical, psychological understanding of how to break free from patterns that have been running your life without you even knowing it. And if you are someone who recognizes yourself in what I am about to describe, I want you to hear this right now. This video is not about fixing you. You are not broken. You adapted. You survived. And today, you are going to learn how to stop surviving and start living. That is the promise. That is the reward for staying. Let us go. Before we dive into the 4 behaviors, you need to understand what you are actually looking at. You need to understand the avoidant mind, not the version the world has created, but the real version, the one that lives underneath all the coldness and distance and silence. An avoidant person is not someone who does not feel. That is the first and most dangerous myth we need to destroy right now. An avoidant person feels everything. They feel it so intensely that their system learned very early in life to shut it down. Not because they chose to, not because they wanted to be distant, but because the volume of what they felt was simply too loud to survive. Think about it this way. When you are a child, you have no control over your environment. You cannot walk away from a toxic home. You cannot leave a parent who loves you and abandons you. You cannot protect yourself from the emotional storms that crash through your life before you are old enough to understand what is happening. So what does a developing mind do? It finds a way to survive. And the way the avoidant mind chose to survive was to stop feeling so much. It learned to build walls. It learned to pull back. It learned to replace emotion with logic because logic does not hurt the way feelings do. That is the origin story. That is where it all begins. Now, here is what most people never understand. These adaptations worked. They actually kept the person safe during childhood. The walls held. The distance kept the pain at a manageable level, and the person grew up believing that these strategies were the reason they survived. So they kept using them, not out of malice, not out of inability to love, but out of deep automatic neurological habit. The avoidant mind is essentially a protection machine. It is always scanning for threats. It is always watching for moments where emotional vulnerability might lead to pain, and the moment it detects even a hint of that danger, it acts. Not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically, like a reflex, like a sneeze. It does not ask permission. It just happens. And this is where it gets confusing for everyone around them. Because from the outside, an avoidant person looks like they do not care. They look like they are fine with walking away. They look like they do not need anyone. And everyone on the outside says, wow, that person is so cold. But what no one sees is the hurricane happening on the inside, the internal war, the part of them that desperately wants to reach out but cannot, the part that wants to stay but does not know how, the part that is screaming underneath the silence. That is the avoidant mind, a place where wanting and fearing exist at the same time, where closeness triggers the same alarm that danger triggers, where love feels like a threat because love once meant pain. Now, let me be very clear about something. This is not an excuse. Understanding the origin does not erase the impact of the behavior. People still get hurt. Connections still break. And the people on the receiving end of avoidant patterns have every right to feel what they feel. But here is why this matters. When you understand that an avoidant person is not choosing coldness, but rather operating from a deeply conditioned survival system, something shifts. The anger softens, the confusion clears, and suddenly you can see the actual person underneath the pattern. And that is where change begins. That is where healing starts. You cannot help someone you do not understand, and you cannot understand someone you only see through the lens of their worst moments. So what we are doing in this video is building that understanding, not to excuse behavior, not to make anyone a victim of their own psychology, but to create a clear picture of what is actually happening inside the mind of someone who feels powerless and does not know how to handle it. Because once you see it clearly, you can work with it. You can respond to it differently. And most importantly, you can recognize your own patterns if you carry them. You can finally see what has been running underneath your life without your permission. And that recognition is the first domino in an entirely new direction. Now that you understand the avoidant mind, we can move forward. We can look at the specific things that happen when that mind feels like it is losing control. And we can start with the one behavior that shows up first, the one that most people notice before anything else, the one that looks like rejection but is actually retreat. That is where we are going next. And I need you to stay, because what I am about to tell you is going to make sense of something that has probably confused you for a very long time. Now that you can see the avoidant mind clearly, we need to go deeper. We need to go to the center, because every behavior we are going to talk about in this video traces back to one central wound, one deep foundational belief that lives at the core of every avoidant pattern. And until you understand that wound, nothing else makes sense. Here it is. The core wound of every avoidant person is the belief that vulnerability is dangerous, not that it is uncomfortable, not that it is inconvenient, but dangerous, life-threatening, the kind of thing that must be avoided at all costs to survive. Let me say that again so it can sink in. Vulnerability feels dangerous to the avoidant mind, like fire, like a loaded weapon, like standing in the middle of a highway with cars coming from every direction. That is the level of threat that emotional vulnerability represents inside the avoidant nervous system. And once you truly understand that, everything changes. Suddenly, the pulling away makes sense. The silence makes sense. The coldness makes sense, not as excuses, but as survival responses to a threat that the body believes is absolutely real. Where does this belief come from? It comes from early life. It comes from moments when being open, being soft, being honest about what you needed got you hurt. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. Maybe a parent who was there, but not really there. A caregiver who gave affection conditionally. Someone who promised safety but delivered abandonment instead. A child who learned that asking for love resulted in disappointment. A child who discovered that showing their real self led to ridicule or rejection. That is where the wound is born. A child experiences emotional pain when they are open. Not once, not twice, but enough times that their brain says, okay, this is the pattern. Opening up leads to hurt. Being real leads to pain. Vulnerability is not safe. So the child does what any smart survival system does. They close the door, they lock it, and they never open it again without extreme caution. This becomes the foundation, the bedrock, the core wound that everything else is built on. Now here is what makes this so powerful and so damaging at the same time. This belief does not stay in childhood. It travels with the person into every relationship, every connection, every intimate moment for the rest of their life. The avoidant adult walks into adult relationships carrying the same wound from childhood. And every time a situation feels similar to those early experiences, the alarm goes off. The same protection system activates, the same behaviors emerge. So when an avoidant person finds themselves in a relationship that starts to feel intense, that starts to demand real emotional presence, something inside them begins to panic. Not because the current situation is dangerous, but because it feels like the old situation. The brain cannot tell the difference between a memory and a current threat. It just knows that this feeling, this depth, this required vulnerability feels like danger. And so the protection kicks in. Here is the critical part you need to understand. The avoidant person is not making a choice. This is not a decision they are making with their adult brain. This is an automatic response from a system that learned very early that emotional exposure equals pain. Their body believes that being vulnerable in this moment will result in the same outcome as it did when they were young and helpless. Therefore, the behavior that follows is not about the current relationship. It is not about you. It is not about whether they love you or want to stay. It is about the wound. It is about a deep, unconscious drive to prevent a repetition of the original hurt. This is why avoidants can walk away from people they care about. This is why they go silent when things get real. This is why they disappear right when you think things are getting close. Because on some level, their nervous system is screaming that if they go any further, they will get hurt again. And their system will do anything to prevent that from happening. The wound is that powerful. The wound controls the behavior without the person even knowing it. And here's what this means for you. If you have been confused by avoidant behavior, if you have blamed yourself, if you have wondered what you did wrong, this is your answer. You did nothing wrong. You did not fail. You did not lack enough. You simply triggered something that was already there. A wound that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with a history that shaped how that person survives. Understanding this changes everything, because now the conversation shifts from what is wrong with this person to what happened to this person. And that shift is where compassion begins and where real change becomes possible. Now that you understand the core wound, we need to go further. We need to talk about what powerlessness actually means in the context of attachment. Because this word gets thrown around casually all the time, and most people do not really understand what it refers to when it comes to the avoidant experience. Let me paint the picture clearly. Powerlessness, in its truest sense, is the feeling that you have no control over the outcome of something that matters deeply to you. It is the sensation that your actions do not determine what happens next, that you are at the mercy of someone else or some circumstance beyond your reach. And this feeling is absolutely unbearable to the human nervous system. Not just difficult, not just uncomfortable, but genuinely unbearable. Because the human brain is wired to need a sense of agency. The feeling that you can influence your own reality. Remove that feeling, and panic sets in automatically. Now, for most people, this feeling comes and goes. It appears in certain situations like job interviews, medical diagnoses, big life transitions. But for the avoidant person, this feeling shows up everywhere because everywhere they go, the possibility of emotional vulnerability follows them. Here is why. For someone who learned very early that being open leads to pain, every situation that requires emotional presence feels like a potential trap. Every moment that asks for honesty, for transparency, for closeness, triggers the same alarm. The alarm that says, this could hurt you. You have no control over how this ends. And if you let yourself go all the way in, you might not survive the outcome. That is what powerlessness feels like inside the avoidant mind. Not just fear of rejection, but a fundamental terror that if they allow themselves to be fully present in an emotionally significant relationship, they will lose the only thing that has kept them safe: their armor, their walls, their ability to walk away before it gets too deep. The moment an avoidant person feels powerlessness, their system interprets it as a direct attack on their autonomy, not consciously, not logically, but deep in the neurological space where survival decisions are made. And when your survival system feels attacked, it does not negotiate, it does not think, it acts. This is where things get confusing for the people around them, because from the outside, nothing catastrophic has happened. Maybe there was a small disagreement. Maybe one person asked for more closeness. Maybe something was said that the other person took personally. The outside world sees a small storm, but inside the avoidant mind, a Category 5 hurricane is breaking loose. Because that small moment connected to the big wound. That small trigger pulled the thread on every time they felt this way before. And the only option their system knows is to do what it always did to survive. Now here's what you need to understand about why their brain reads certain situations as threats. The avoidant brain has a pattern recognition system that works differently than most. It is constantly scanning for evidence that vulnerability is unsafe. And because it learned this lesson so early and so deeply, it does not need clear proof. It only needs a hint, a resemblance, a similarity to something that once caused pain. The moment that similarity appears, the alarm sounds and the protection activates. So a partner saying, "I need more from you," does not sound like a request for connection inside the avoidant mind. It sounds like a demand they cannot meet, a pressure that threatens their sense of self, a loss of control disguised as love. That is why what feels like a normal conversation to most people can feel like an existential crisis to an avoidant. The content of the conversation is not the problem. The problem is what the conversation represents. It represents a situation where they are being asked to open up, to be seen, to be emotionally present, and they have no guarantee that doing so will not destroy them. That is powerlessness in the avoidant context. And now you see why the behaviors we are about to discuss are not choices. They are desperate, automatic responses to a threat that most people cannot even see.